All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening on behalf of the Social Justice Commission, which organized this book series this summer. Special thanks to Vicki Ix for all of her amazing work and great job publicizing and organizing. I'm Tim Crellin. I'm rector of St. Paul's in Gardner, and so delighted to be here with my dear friend Tina Rathbone so we could talk about her amazing book tonight. Um, but let's start with prayer. So we'll take maybe just a moment to center and get ourselves here, and then I will share a prayer. This is a prayer for global solidarity that adapted comes from Catholic Relief Services. So let us be at prayer. O Creator, our world is large, and yet the global community is so fragile. We glimpse the needs of our siblings, and those needs are great. We want to turn away, but you call us back. We want simple solutions, but you want us to help solve the complex problems. Through your church, you call us to listen, to learn, to reflect, and to act. Give us a deep sense of our place in this web of creation. Give us the wisdom of mind and generosity of heart to seek you in the world today. Inspire us to respond to the call to live in solidarity with the poor, with refugees and asylum seekers, with those on the margins, with those targeted by unjust policies, so that all children of God might live in dignity and peace. Amen.
Amen.
So I hope you've had a chance to read at least some of Asylum Seekers. It is a remarkable and moving book, and I'm so pleased that we get to spend this time with the author. Tina and I first met many years ago when Tina was beginning to explore a vocation to the ordained ministry. After just one conversation, I knew that our church needed her voice and her witness. She has consistently located herself among those who are least seen: women in prison, people living on the streets, asylum seekers on the border. Her skill as a writer, journalist, and witness with the heart of a pastor make these people's lives and experiences real to us. And her reflections on these intolerable situations and crises as a person of faith are deeply meaningful. I know that many of you know Tina well as a friend and colleague, so it's a pleasure to have you with us tonight, Tina, and we appreciate your making the time. You know, the term the border is kind of a synecdoche for everything that is broken about immigration policy, the effects of US imperialism, the polarization in our society about immigration. We talk about the border, but very few of us understand what happens at the border between the US and Mexico and how global dynamics affect the lives of real people who are literally fleeing for their lives. Tina invested her time in trying to change that in a way that illuminates our hearts and our minds and puts us in that place so that we can understand what's happening. So I'm going to invite Tina to talk a little bit about how this book, Asylum Seekers, came to be. And then she and I will have some conversation, and Tina will read a couple of passages. And then we'll take your questions, which we invite you to put into the chat. And then Vicki and I will extract them from there. So Tina, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. It's great to be with you. And everyone's disappeared, but that's okay. And it's great to be with all of you from the Diocese of Western Mass. And I hope it's okay to say particularly with those of you who I know so well from Grace Church. And not to pick anyone out, but particularly to see you hiding behind your dad, Jacob, which is a gift, just to see the top of your head there. What a wonderful thing to see you. So it's a little distracting. It's like different locations. But yeah, I'm here today to talk about a work that I did before I went to Western Mass. So I was just leaving the community of homeless people that I served for 12 years here in Boston. A group of chronically unhoused folks and I started a faith community together, and I served that community for 12 years. And as many of you know, if you kind of get a community started, the general rule of thumb is that you leave after 9 or 10 years. So I was already late in my leaving, in order that the community can continue to flourish and have new life. And it was 2019, and it was the first go round of our current administration. I am half Cuban and half English, and so all my Cuban family, huge family, every single one of them except my two brothers and I, arrived in this country with one suitcase, coming through the border and being offered a chance at a new life here, which they grabbed and ran with and made new lives here, every single one of them. So back in 2019, I felt a very personal, almost biological call to go to the border when horrific policies. This was when families were being separated. You remember all those horrible photos in the newspapers. People were dying crossing the Rio Grande. That horrific photo of a father and his child, which really was a very important day for me, the day that photo came out in the paper. So I went down to the border to see what I could do as a human being, as an American passport holder. What responsibilities did that burden me with, and also as a priest, as an Episcopal priest, and to see whether everything that I'd learned about making community in the hardest of circumstances, Christian community, and the supports that offers everyone, if that could be transplanted to the border, if it might be of any use. But I didn't know, because the first thing that homeless folks taught me was that it's no good just creating a ministry and plonking it down somewhere. You have to go to the place and listen and learn from the people who are there, who are primarily affected, and then create a ministry in response to their declared needs and their obvious strengths. So I raised money to last me 6 months. I ended up staying more than a year, but that's another long story, and roamed around on the border, listening and learning, sitting in with different organizations, secular and religious, and finally ended up in Juarez, El Paso, which is basically one city in this great bowl, in a desert bowl surrounded by desert mountains. And it really does show you how random borders really are, because if you go up to one of those mountains and you look down, that is one city. That is not two countries, two cities. It's one single place. However, divided by the US-Mexico border. Not a place I was drawn to in any way. The desert terrifies me. Also, there's no trees, no grass. There's nothing that anybody from the East Coast or from England would ever recognize. And I thought I would be in and out in a couple of days with gratitude and return to Tijuana, where I was planning to start a ministry. But when I was there volunteering, I would walk across the bridge every day and then turn left and walk down this one particular road to a big tent, which was a welcoming center for folks who were sent back to Mexico from the US immigration detention centers. About 300 were sent back every day. And that road, I one day turned down that road and I saw people who seemed like they'd slept on the street, which of course I could recognize after all these years of working with homeless folks. But I kind of brushed it aside. And then the next day, more people were there, and clearly they'd spent the night. And over the next several weeks, a community of asylum seekers appeared out of nowhere on this one block in downtown Juarez. They were all Mexicans, which was a new thing. Mexicans seeking to flee Mexico. So they were very, very imperiled because they're still in the country that they're seeking to flee. Juarez is also the 5th most dangerous city in the world, and downtown Juarez, one of the most dangerous neighborhoods of that city. And it was mostly families camping out on the sidewalk. So imagine a sidewalk, a block in Pittsfield or in Springfield, in the worst neighborhood, and then imagine moving with your young children to live there until the US allows you to ask for asylum. And that was what these, at the peak of it, it was a community of 500 families living squashed on this one block, no tents, no sleeping bags, no nothing. Why they were on the street and not in the shelters was because obviously they were in their own country, so they could be wherever they wanted to be. They didn't have to be in migrant shelters. And what they wanted was access to the Border Patrol to ask for asylum in the US. Since the mid-40s, after the Second World War, it has been international and US law that anybody can ask for the protection of a neighboring country if they're in flight for their lives. And yet, time after time after time after time after time after time, thousands of times a day, people were denied that right. I'm not talking about the right to have asylum, which is a long, long process, but the right to request asylum. They were never told, no, you cannot request asylum, because everybody knew that would be blatantly illegal. So instead, what they were told was, not right now, come back later. Over and over and over again. Not right now, we're full, come back later. Not right now, we're full, come back later. And so in this way, people were prevented from asking for asylum and was stuck there in this tiny, weeny little block, pressed up in the space between two countries. It became clear that this was the community I was supposed to serve. And so I stayed. And I worked with them to develop structures, leadership structures, and community rules and regulations to support that community of people who were very imperiled. So what would that take to keep people safe? What would it take to keep people fed? What would it take to keep people sheltered and watered? Luckily, the community were jam-packed with overachievers, because contrary to what we all hear in the press, people who are fleeing for their lives from their local communities are the leaders of their communities. They are the people who are standing up to corruption and oppression. They are the people taking their lives in their hands and saying, no, I will not bow down to this. I will not go along with this. And they are therefore the people who are targeted. So this street community was packed with people who were leaders in their communities across the country of Mexico. So they really needed very little help at all. I mostly needed to learn from them. And then over time, did what I could as an American and as an ordained member of the US clergy to help them up their odds a tiny bit in being able to ask for asylum, and also to help them organize stuff in the States that they obviously didn't have access to. Faith communities in El Paso, Catholic and Episcopal, UCC, all of the denominations, really, Lutherans, to help get items that they really, really needed to survive. And so that's what I did. And day by day, week by week, learnt more about the extraordinary faith and courage of these people that I was so blessed to work with, and began classes for the kids, which weren't really classes, but we'll talk more about that later, a semblance of normalcy for a period of time during the day. And most of all, encountered Jesus, which is almost always my aim, in the face, right in front of me, in people old and my age and young, people of such deep faith, total love, absolute generosity, and profound grace that taught me every day a little bit more about how to be human and also about how to be a priest. So that really is the work that lasted just 4 months, that I write about in this book. I had no intention of writing a book when I went down there. In fact, I had no intention of writing a book when I got back. But I was somewhat done in by the work and found myself unable to speak about what had happened there. I just couldn't find the words. And so began writing as a way of finding the words, and then slowly, slowly remembered that writing was something that I used to do, and so made a book out of it. So that's how that book came to be. And one last word about the community. I mean, I could babble on for hours, but the reason why it lasted just 4 months is that in the end, the community was bulldozed by the Mexican government because the president was coming for a visit, and he didn't want to be embarrassed by the sight of Mexican asylum seekers seeking protection in the US. Of course, this was denied, but it was an astonishing coincidence if that wasn't the reason. And so one day bulldozers came into the street and just took people's lean-tos and all the possessions they'd managed to escape from their homes with, chucked them in a garbage truck where they were consumed and destroyed. And so I then stayed in Mexico until the last member of that community that was on the street was able to request asylum. 45 of them went and stayed in an Anglican shelter that was supported by the Episcopal Diocese of the Rio Grande. Others scattered across sort of pay-by-the-hour hotels. And one by one, everyone was able to ask for asylum, though largely because the administration had created a number of knots and impossibilities within the system whereby they would just be thrown right back out again. And so when the last person was let in to request asylum, I then left and returned here to Boston, to my home.
That's great, Tina. Thank you for kind of that, giving us that background and introduction. I was just amazed by how quickly you developed this broad ministry. The church usually spends years forming committees and planning and raising money before we can do almost anything. And you just went and did it. And so I wonder what were the biggest surprises and what were the biggest challenges that you had to overcome to get established?
Thanks, Tim. Excellent question. Yes. So here's a thing that many people don't believe is true, but that is true, is if you just start doing the work, the money will come. It always does. Absolutely always comes. There's so much money in our country, and people are desperate to be liberated from it to a certain degree. They just want to give it to something that is real. And so if you can show that the work that you're doing is real, the money will come. So I learned that back here in Boston, and just really knew it was true. So I didn't worry about the money aspect of it too much, though of course it was in my brain. Also, these were people living in such dire need and people in El Paso, as I said before, it's one city, right? So everybody knew about these people. And so it was not hard to get people to give money for food, to give food, to help make sandwiches, to help, bring mattresses, all that stuff. That stuff just naturally happened. And then, thanks be to God, the Diocese of the Rio Grande were incredibly supportive. And they ended up taking up the work, and it's still going on. It was called the Bridge Chaplaincy, and it became a part of the work that the diocese does on the border. So that's that part of it. And then the rest, the ministry evolved as is the case with my work almost always, as was certainly the case at Grace, as was certainly the case here in Boston beforehand, organically. There's a need, or there's a set of strengths, or there's a desire, and then there's some people who are interested, and one thing leads to another, and so it happens. So always responding to the reality on the ground. There's a great line that one of my teachers in Juarez, a woman named Cristina Coronado, came up with at a meeting, and the line was, "Let's let reality be our teacher for now." And I think that's just a line of such profound wisdom and humility and truth. Let's let reality be our teacher. So if we open our ears, especially the ears of our heart and the eyes of our heart, reality will show us the next thing to do. And it won't be perfect. It won't be anything like perfect, shouldn't even be in the sentence. It will just be what it is. But then it will improve as time goes on, and as we learn more, and as more people with more gifts come to help it evolve. And again, I would spend my evenings, because to be completely honest, I was afraid of Juarez. It's women are killed there. It's the city that invented the term femicide in Spanish, but because so many women are killed so brutally there. And I stayed, just to be clear about my nature, in El Paso. So every day I went home to this city that the people I was working with were not able to enter. Very complicated in and of itself. But I would spend my evenings thinking, oh, my Spanish is terrible. I have no Spanish grammar. I know nothing about Juarez. I know nothing about the border. I really don't know anything about it. I know nobody here. I'm not enough for this work. But then I'd get back to the border the next day, and nobody cared whether I was enough or not because I was there. And so that came to feel self-indulgent, that worrying about whether I was the right person, whether I was doing it right, irrelevant. I was there, and that just had to be enough for that moment.
Administrative presence.
Yeah.
We here at St. Paul's, we engaged with the community of Haitian asylum seekers that were living in a hotel, and we hosted a day where they met with attorneys to talk about their asylum applications. Can you talk a little bit more about what that process involves and what it means to be an asylum seeker?
Yeah. So as I said earlier, everyone is guaranteed the right to request the protection of another country if they're fleeing for their lives. And asylum is just a fancy way of saying the protection of another country. And it is a legal path into the States. And people who are seeking asylum are choosing to enter the States through a legal path. And I don't generally like to make too much of that because people who enter in different ways also have their reasons and are lesser in no way. But it bears mentioning that this is a legal path. So they can't just slip across the border. They have to be allowed in at a port of entry and to request asylum. If you're on US soil, so if you have the money and you fly in and you have a visa and you're that type of person, you can request asylum in the US airport. None of these people come from backgrounds like that. So they had to be on US soil. And once you're on US soil, you have to be granted the right to request asylum. So what we did, the Border Patrol, the US Border Patrol is built a little tent at the top of the bridge leading from Mexico to the US. Exactly where there's a brass line, there is literally a brass line and a plaque that says, Estado de Mexico, the United States of America. And just 2 inches on the Mexican side of that line is where they put the tent. So that asylum seekers were not in the US when they were requesting the right to ask for asylum. They were still in Mexico by 2 inches. Therefore, they were told, come back later, come back later. So the other thing that's important to know about asylum is it's not a cover-all way to come to the States. You can't just say, I'm poor, I have no money, my children are starving, even my children are starving to death. That will not get you asylum. There are only 5 pathways to being given asylum, and I'm not going to remember them all right now. But they are if you're a member of a particular religious group, if you're a member of a particular minority, if you've suffered incarceration or torture, threat of torture by the government, and 2 others. Very specific. So if you have one of those 5 methods to gain asylum, then you will be granted asylum eventually after years of appearing in court and proving your case.
What I remember from this conversation with the lawyers here was, they were saying to folks, you can't just say, I was afraid for my life. You have to say, this person did this to me on this day, and I went to the police and reported. It's very hard to.
And here's the paperwork.
Right.
And here's the paperwork is the hard bit, because the journeys that people have undertaken to get to the States, I mean, imagine you have a piece of paper that's in your backpack. Now imagine you cross half the world and a jungle and you escape this, that, and the other. You still have to have that piece of paper. So it's very, very, very hard to prove. And also people would say, the US interviewers would say, well, did you go to the police? And the Mexicans would say, well, no, of course we didn't go to the police, because everybody in Mexico knows the police are completely corrupt and no one would go to the police. But they didn't know that the US doesn't know that, so they had to be told, no, you have to really spell it out detail by detail by detail. And still most people are not granted asylum in the end.
Yeah, one of the most heartbreaking realities that you document is the return of families who made it through the checkpoint only to have their applications for asylum rejected and to be sent back. I mean, what happens to those people, and how did you relate to them as a representative of the church and a citizen of the US when they were kind of came, back across the bridge?
I mean, it was so utterly heartbreaking and so devastating, especially as the administration was creating more and more methods whereby they could send people back, as they are also doing now. The community that was seeking asylum needed to believe that America was the answer. That's all they had. America is the answer. And so if people were sent back, it was like a bad omen. And people, they didn't stick around. They left. They didn't stick around back on the street. They couldn't apply for asylum again for 10 years. So there's no point sticking around. They've got no money left. So they have to go back. And their hopes are dashed. They're exhausted. They've been living out on the sidewalk with their children for months. And now they can't go home for the most part because it's too dangerous. They fled from home. So they go to some distant state where a cousin's sister's fiance's stepmother lives and sleep on her floor and try to make a start again. But here is where the deep, deep faith comes in, because that's what they have left. A deep felt sense that God is with them no matter what, and that what God wills for them is life and love and community and safety. And so with that, they walk off, walking off often, sometimes being able to afford a bus ticket to go to this state, which is again a completely new place for them. And one family who I knew very well, the father stayed, and the mother and son, not that I had favorites, but that son was totally one of my favorites. They took a 200-mile detour to go visit the Basilica of Our Lady of, I don't remember what right now, to give thanks for their safety. A 200-mile detour. And it was when they would tell me stories like that, that I realized how much I had to learn.
You wrote at one point after just a beautiful conversation with some children, you said, and then I had to leave because I was really going to utterly, utterly lose it. You were standing in the face of this incredible injustice and particularly witnessing the impact on children. What could you say to the children, and how did you keep from utterly, utterly losing it? And then maybe you could read a little bit after you answer that.
I didn't keep from utterly, utterly losing it, but I did, for the most part, I hope, keep from utterly, utterly losing it in front of the children, and in front of the adults as well. I would utterly and utterly lose it in El Paso. The kids, were like children everywhere, utterly extraordinary, so resilient, so full of hope and life and laughter, so ready to invent games, to play, to laugh, to learn, to hang out, to be tickled, the whole thing. And it became very clear to me early on that they were bored out of their heads. They're trapped on one block. There's nowhere to go. The city's so dangerous. The parents don't let them go anywhere. There's a little strip of street that's closed off to traffic, but that's it. It's 110 degrees in the sun. So after a couple of failed attempts, we started some classes for them. We called them English classes. They were really not English classes because I don't know how to teach English or anything to young children. What they were an hour a day, first on the street and then in a building across a block, where they could cut and color and draw and read stories and be read to, and line up and go a place and, have snack and those kinds of things the same time every day. And those classes really became the core of my work there. And in fact, many of the adults call me maestra, Tina. They didn't call me reverenda. They call me maestra. I was the teacher. And the kids were the ones who kept us all afloat. Even, of course, as the adults were the ones keeping the kids afloat. So it was that cycle of love that never stops giving. And I adored them. And they were our teachers. What is it that Jesus says? If you want to inherit the kingdom of heaven, become like a child. And I think that's what he means. They were able, if not to create the kingdom of heaven, at least to create spaces of freedom and joy, which then filtered out to the adults around them. So yeah, if it's okay, I'd love to read just a couple of pages. And in fact, it ends with that line that you just said, Tim. And this is this passage comes about halfway through the book. And so I have already started to accompany folks up to that tent that I described to you earlier, because it was slightly helpful sometimes to have someone with a collar and a big old cross, US passport holder, standing there with the asylum seekers. It helped more when immigration lawyers came. They almost always got through then. It helped more when bishops came. They almost always got through. When human rights organizations came, they got through instantly. I was not that powerful, but at least I upped the chances, though often, we were sent back down again. So this reading happens when Tanya, who was a lawyer who came every week to talk to folks about asylum, came with a bunch of immigration attorneys from across the states, which happened fairly regularly. Okay, so relax, everybody. It's about 3 pages. Tanya brought a team of lawyers who were visiting from across the states for an unplanned and additional charla, or chat, on the street. They spoke with the community, clarifying again the fundamental requirements for asylum, visited one of our classes for the kids, and then offered to accompany a couple of families up to the checkpoint. Initially, a crowd huddled in the shade, trying to decide how many people should go up with the team. 2 families? 3? When they finally agreed to go with 3, the call went out, echoing down the street. Familias 1, 2 y 3. Familias 1, 2 y 3, until the 3 families at the top of the list emerged, ducking under the flaps of their little houses, packs stuffed tight as stones on their backs, caps pulled low. Except Luis, the rakish kid who always wore his baseball cap sideways, and did that day too, though he was visibly terrified under it, as they all were. It had been so long since anyone had gotten through to request asylum. 8 full days of trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing. And the hope the presence of the lawyers brought undid us all. A prayer came easily, for God's mercy to fill the hearts of the Border Patrol, for God's courage to fill the 3 families, and for God's grace to course through everyone who would not get through today, bringing them what they needed in ways they could actually feel. Afterwards, I crouched down to speak more intimately with Luis and the other 2 kids. I needed to express something to them, to imbue them with some urgent thing, and it turned out to be this: how extraordinary they were, and how lucky my country was that they were hoping to move there. And, most of all, that however hard the next few days may be, they had all they needed already, right there in their hearts. The intensity with which the kids listened to all this was sobering to the point of silencing. Stunned a bit by it, and wanting also to arm them again for the reality that awaited, I lumbered back up to my feet and gently cuffed Louise's jaunty sideways cap the way I always did. But he just kept looking at me and looking at me, until he turned to follow his family, single file, up through the turnstiles and onto the bridge. We were all openly weeping by then, and at least partly because we all needed space to subdue both our hope and our fears, we quickly dispersed. Hoping for a few minutes of solitude, I set off for the black and white coffee shop on Juarez Ave, where I'd become a regular. But another little boy, Samuel, far smaller than Luis and without the pizzazz, stopped me as I passed. He'd been trying to speak to me earlier, and I'd told him then that he needed to wait. So here he was again now, silent in front of me with his even littler sister and his only just taller mom. I stopped, crouched down to be at eye level with him, and waited. For a time, the 3 of them just stood there in a straight line, little boy, tiny girl, slightly taller mom. Then Samuel began to tell me what he'd been trying to tell me all afternoon, that his mother was afraid, that she had heard that the kids would be separated from her in detention and that they would be inside for months and months, and it would be freezing, and they'd have nothing to keep themselves warm and not enough to eat. And if either of the children, he or his sister, he said, looking down at his sister for a moment, started to cry for any reason, or maybe even to squabble, that the guards would come in and beat them and then take them away. Was this true? He asked, this boy who looked maybe 7, and who was speaking already so lucidly and fluently on behalf of his mother, who was too afraid to speak, even to me. This was what his mother had heard, he repeated. This was what people had told her, that they would be separated, even if they made just one mistake. I can't describe the intense effect this tiny boy, speaking like a man on behalf of his terrified mother, had on me. He stood so straight, and he spoke so quietly, and also so clearly, because it was important what he was saying, he knew, and he might not get another chance. Is it true that me and my sister will be sent to live with strangers? He asked then. Do you have family over there? I asked. Yes. Then you will probably go and live with them together. But they live in Orlando, Florida, he anguished, as if it were the real name of hell. I tried to let him know that every kid in the world wanted to go to Orlando, Florida, because that was where Disney World was, but I don't think he'd ever heard of Disney. Mickey Mouse lives there, I said stupidly, turning to his little sister, and Donald Duck. Does Little Pony live there too? I love Little Pony, his sister said. Yes, Little Pony too, I said, and still the boy stood there, straight and as tall as he could make himself, asking his questions, voicing the fears of his family. I told him then that I was a priest, and was therefore not allowed to lie, not ever, and that I had never heard of children being separated from their mother because they cried or squabbled, or of them being beaten. But it was not enough. It was as if Samuel was waiting for something. And then all of a sudden I knew what it was. I took off the bracelet I'd been wearing every day, the one Judy from the homeless community back in Boston had given me that read, "Though she be but small, she is fierce." And I wrapped it around his wrist, pressing the metal ends together so they touched around his tiny arm, telling him as I did so what it said. I added that the adults might take it away from him in detention, but that they would have to give it back when he left to go to Orlando, Florida, and that it didn't matter anyway whether he had it or not, because it was true what it said. He was fierce, and he already had everything he needed in his heart. I pointed to his heart then, and then to his sister's heart, and to his mother's heart, and told him that God lived in there. God. And that no one could ever take God away. Ever. The intensity between us then must have been palpable, because a silent and creeping group of wide-eyed little kids had started to gather around us. So I pointed to each of their hearts too, one by one, and very quietly told each one of them the same. God is in here. God is in here. God is in here. God is in here. And then I had to leave, because I really was going to utterly lose it.
Thank you so much for, it's so beautiful, Tina, for bringing us into that place, so evocative and meaningful.
Thank you.
One of the many things
let's just spend, because we're all praying people. It's not often that I'm in a group of 100% praying people, but let's just maybe spend 30 seconds, if you wouldn't mind, praying for Samuel and his family, wherever they may be. They're in Mexico, that I know. Thank you.
One of the things I admire about you, Tina, is the way that you create space for prayer that is not traditional, not, organized worship, whether it's on the streets of Boston with Manna or in Great Barrington. How was prayer? I was amazed by some of the stories you told about prayer, and how did you feel invited, to pray with people in that place?
Yeah, so we didn't have many formal worship services because almost everyone was Catholic, and I obviously am not a Catholic priest. Um, if I were a man, I just would have let them think what they think, but I can't get away
Mhm.
with it as a woman. So we did have a couple of really profound worship services on the street for the Virgin of Guadalupe Day on December 12th, which was very powerful. For the Day of the Dead, we had a big worship service, and the women of the community created one of the most beautiful altars. My book originally had photos in it, but
Mm.
the publishing company took them all out, which is fine. But it's impossible to imagine how beautiful this altar was, a marching altar going up like a wedding cake, covered with marigolds and every kind of decoration. They built this out of fruit crates and scraps. It was just extraordinary. And the prayers that came out of that service, I created a service and we had formal prayers, but then the prayers that came were just undoing. And then it turned into a big party, which was another way of praying with guitars that we borrowed from some nuns in El Paso and singing. It was so, so powerful. But mostly, and Christmas, of course, we had a posada, and that's a whole other story, which I actually found that posada to be absolutely overwhelming and way too much.
Mm.
The posadas is a Mexican tradition where you travel and you ask to come in. You echo the Holy Family's journey of being rejected. But on that street, in that place, where these families were literally being rejected every day, it just felt overwhelming to me.
Mm.
The asylum seekers actually, I think, found some solace in it. But I just almost couldn't stand it. And luckily, the bishop, Bishop Michael Hunn, was there. And he then went up with a group of families and was so over the top, not having the way our country was dealing with it, and got them in. An
Mm.
incensed bishop is going to beat a border patrol agent anytime. But most of the prayer was one-on-one, though we prayed every time families went up to ask for asylum as a community. But mostly it was one-on-one. And mostly the prayer took the form of, like what I just read, of me trying by my presence there as a priest. And this is what's so wonderful about being a priest, is it means it's not Tina there, who's, just like whatever, another person, but it's this representative of the community of the church that stretches back across time and space for 2,000 years. And that's a lot more useful.
Mm.
So not bringing Jesus, obviously, who is already there in superabundance, but bringing the community of the church present was something that was really powerful, and mostly that I did through silence, and listening and doing what I could to receive stories of unbelievable horror, and by receiving these stories, to be a witness to them, and so to validate the person suffering. And did that feel like something that was useful? Most of the time it did not. Most of the time it felt like, this is insane. What am I doing? What can I do to fix this situation? And of course, I can't do anything to fix this situation. But I do actually believe in my heart, retroactively, and in general, that witnessing to someone's, with an open heart, without trying to fix anything, to someone's suffering, is in some mysterious and grace-filled way helpful, if only because it lessens the isolation, and restores a little bit of dignity to the person who has so often been stripped of it. And so it was really more of a prayerful presence than prayers that I offered. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, Tim.
It does. No, it's great. Uh, you mentioned, I think we're all feel inspired to do something. I certainly do as I read your book, and so I wondered what you know about how things are in Juarez, El Paso now under the current situation, and how things maybe have changed since you were there or not changed. And then I think you were maybe going to read a second piece that um, kind of gives us a little bit of direction and for those who are interested in learning more.
Sorry. As I'm sure you all know, the border is closed, shut. There's so many soldiers there. It's ridiculous. They have nothing to do. They have huge tanks. I just saw this morning someone sent a picture of a gigantic tank and a US soldier leaning against it, and just around him absolute nothingness. And she just said, there's really nothing to add to this picture, but it just seems important to record what's going on. No one is getting through at all. It's completely shut down. There is no requesting asylum, zero, anywhere on the border. And so that's terrible. What's also happening that's perhaps even more terrible, or equally as terrible, or who cares, also terrible, is that the administration's approach is working and people are choosing to leave before they are deported. People
Self-deport.
Yeah, to self-deport. People are terrified, A, of being separated from their children, and B, of being sent to some random place like South Sudan, or, God forbid, El Salvador. So people are leaving with their families together. And the people that I worked with, the woman I mentioned earlier, let's let reality be our teacher for now, Cristina Coronado, she works out of the Catholic Cathedral in Juarez. She's extraordinary. And that is one of the first stops for people who are crossing the border. Many of them don't have their papers, their passports, their identity cards, because Border Patrol still has them, because they keep them when they came in originally until, all the court cases are heard, and they can't access them. So they're arriving in Mexico with no papers. So they can't fly by plane. Let's say they come from other countries, they can't fly there by plane. And Cristina is working with them to figure out what's best and what's next with them, as are many other organizations. And I was there recently. I was there 2 months ago. And 70% of the people returning were choosing to settle in Juarez because there's work in Juarez. And so people are looking for housing, people are looking for clothing, people are trying to raise money to get school uniforms for children, because in Mexico, you can't go to school unless you have a school uniform and a sports uniform and a pair of shoes. That's what you need to go to school. And that set costs $100. So that's the kind of work that's going on. It's so tragic, and I'm so sorry to have to be the one telling it, but people are traveling now in the other direction. So I do have information, and maybe, Vicky, I could send you that information. And if you want to send $100 or any part thereof, $5, to Christina's, she works with the Columban Fathers out of the cathedral, and it will have all the memo information for you to write. And that 100% of that money will go towards getting school uniforms for those kids so they can go to school.
That would be wonderful, Tina. Thank you.
I'd love to do that. But also, that's over there. That's in Juarez. It's really far away from Western Mass. And tragically, one doesn't need to travel more than a couple of blocks now to encounter the effects of the administration's policy towards immigrants of all kinds. And, I know, because my current work is to work with faith communities around immigration, that ICE has been as present in Western Mass as they are in Eastern Mass, and that they've been exercising their raids everywhere, including in Great Barrington, which I mention only because that's the town that I know and love so well, but also in towns up and down Western Mass. And so I just want to encourage you all, as I'm sure many of you are already doing, please send money to Cristina, don't get me wrong, in Juarez, but also please do look for ways to get involved locally, because it will not be hard to find opportunities. And I'm saying this for the sake of the immigrants who, by the way, I know from my current work, feel as if Americans have left them en masse. So they don't feel the effects of these big rallies where everybody's saying we stand for immigrants. They don't feel that. They need direct contact with people with stable immigration status to feel that support. So find a local organization and find a way to meet and be met by people and to be transformed by them, because they hold that power just as you hold that power. And I'm talking about tiny things that make a real difference to the lives of everyone. And I know, because I know a portion of you on this call, that many of you are already doing tiny things in your local community. And I just want to encourage you to continue doing it. And if I have 3 minutes just to read one page, is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have questions for Tina, you could drop them in the chat. We'll have time for one or two, I think. There's one, but if anyone else has a question you'd like to ask as she reads.
Here, by way of gratitude for you all and encouragement, is what I really believe and came to believe ever more deeply on the border is the way forward. Unless we have power. If we have power, if we're politicians, great. If we're lawyers, great. They have to be doing big things. But for most of us, we can do small things, and they count too. Small, real things. Small, real things. This is what I kept trying to remember on the border and to trust. Not big, impressive things, but small, real things are the way to love, with, through, and for the other. Small not because we can't be bothered, but because we are small ourselves. And because every time we honor this smallness without shutting down, every time we acknowledge our lack of sufficiency and remain willing even so to both meet and be met by the other, well, whatever follows then will both come from and lead to the realm of abundance some of us call God, and real transformation will happen only on an infinitesimal scale. This is how small, real things make a small, real difference. And this is important too, because small, real things are necessarily incarnate. They cannot be faked or sold or even advertised. They can only be sought in the moment and then welcomed. They require nothing flashy, nothing expensive, only a mute and muscularly passive stance full of willingness and reliability and vulnerability. It isn't that small, real things don't sometimes become large, real things, because they do. It isn't the smallness that's the point, but the intention. It's as if the act of desiring and then seeking something small liberates us to receive without measure. As if by not aiming for bigness or even for success, we somehow become freed from the regular marketplace world in which something is always given in exchange for something else, and enter instead a realm where giving and receiving become the same thing. Here are a couple of sentences by Sandra Cisneros, which cheered me up one dark night in El Paso, because they say more or less the same thing, only more simply. I don't know anything, she writes, but I know this. Whatever is done with love, in the name of others, without self-gain, whatever is done with the heart on behalf of someone or something, whatever work we make with complete humility will always come out beautifully, and something more valuable than fame or money will come. This I know.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Perfect after we heard the Good Samaritan on Sunday to hear that, her words and your words. So there's a question in the chat. I think the question is, if you are granted asylum status, does that, is there a timeline by which you have to, become a citizen, or does the asylum expire at some point, in which making you, I guess, vulnerable at that point to being deported? That may not be a question you know the answer to, but Because I think you just, yeah, there you go.
Can we go back to, yay, thank you. No, once you're granted asylum, well, the answer to that question is who knows anymore? Who knows?
Yeah.
It used to be the case that once you're granted asylum, you're on track then to get a green card and then citizenship. You were not able to be deported. It is still the case that if you have an asylum case in process, that you cannot be deported. As of today, it is still the case, which is why lots of people, lots of Haitians, Cubans, Venezuelans, all those people who had TPS, which is a phrase that's bandied around a lot, they were all encouraged to apply for asylum, because once that case is processing, it should be the case. It is today, you cannot be deported.
Other questions for Tina? Well, if you haven't had a chance to read the book, I highly encourage you. You got a little taste of it tonight, and of just how much it will connect you to this experience. So there are two parts to this summer book series. The other part will happen on Zoom on August 19th at 6. And we'll be talking about my book that was published almost at the same time as Tina's, which also is on the topic of immigration. And Nina Pooley, who's here tonight, will be talking together. So love to have you come to that. I had a lot of fun with Jane Griesbach's book group the other night. We had a lot of fun talking about the book. So I hope you can join us on August 19th. Leah, I think this question's for you, Tina. Leah asked, what are good groups to connect with in Western Mass or statewide, perhaps? I know you're working with Mass Council.
Yeah, I'm working with Mass Council and Basic. Well, that's Berkshire's. I don't know. I don't know I can't remember right now what it stands for, but they're very engaged. I'm still on their email list, and they're very engaged with immigration work. So Basic, and I'm not up with local groups. You're just going to have to rummage around and find them. But literally, if you Google immigrants community organizations, you will find them. And at this point, everyone can use your help. Everyone. I just want to say, there's really not a single question?
Tina, I'll just say, I have the thought that our silence is prayerful. You know, that we're holding what you've given us.
Thanks, Vicky.
Overwhelmed is a one word. And people are posting Berkshire Immigrant Center, Pioneer Valley Workers.
We can probably send a follow-up email if people have other ideas. Put them in the comments, and we'll send out a follow-up email with contact info.
That sounds great, Leah. Thanks. Well, Tina, it's just so great that you could take the time to be with us. Really appreciate it. Love you, and glad we could do this together. Look at Nina with the last second getting her question there. Want to thank you for your advice around not nearly being enough, being empowering in its own right. Thank you. I agree. Yeah. Thank you so much for modeling so well the ministry of accompaniment. And I feel moved to read Psalm 121 for some reason. So I invite us to be a prayer and close with the words from Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved, and he who watches over you will not fall asleep. Behold, he who keeps watch over Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord himself watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand, so that the sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. It is he who shall keep you safe. The Lord shall watch over your going out and your coming in from this time forth forevermore.
Um,
Amen.